Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 92, which is NT Pod Live. In the 11 years or so that I've done the NT Pod, I've never had a live episode, and the current coronavirus crisis, with us all sitting at home, made me think, do you know what, it would be a great idea to give this a go. So this is my first attempt at having an episode of this kind. We made it fairly free-ranging. People just called in or texted in their questions and their feedback, and I yabbered on a little bit. If you enjoy this episode, then I might do another one, and perhaps next time we'll give it a tighter theme so that we can talk about a specific topic. But I hope that this experiment at least proves worthwhile repeating, and if not, your feedback is of course always welcome. Okay, I've got a question from G1, presumably guest number one. Am I working on a book, and if so, what will it cover? Yes, I'm working on a book at the moment on John's Gospel. The working title is Fourth Gospel, the case for John's knowledge of the Synoptics. So anyone that's read my previous stuff or has heard about my previous stuff will know that it's basically a similar kind of topic from the ones I've done before. So Case Against Q came out in 2002, and that argued that Luke knows Matthew and Mark. Then Thomas and the Gospels came out 10 years later, and that argues that the Gospel of Thomas knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This one, I kind of joked that it was a third part in a trilogy. I'm obviously not writing a trilogy, but it's sort of the third aspect of the thing, which is arguing that John knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John knows the Synoptics. And my aim is to finish it in August. I was going to complete it while on a visiting fellowship in Cambridge this summer, but of course with the coronavirus thing, that's been cancelled. So it depends on how well I can manage to discipline myself to do it, along with everything else that I'll have to do back here. But my hope is still to finish that book this summer, which means it will come out next year. So, and the title isn't official yet, but I kind of like the idea of calling it Fourth Gospel, because everybody talks about John as the fourth gospel, but nobody actually practically thinks about it as a fourth gospel that for much of its history has been read as a book that presupposes the three synoptics. And I think that not only was John written to presuppose the three synoptics, but I think that's the way that many people have read it throughout the whole of history. And I think those two things can go together. So thank you for that question. And that's the current work. I have a question from Andrew Doole. Hi, Andrew. What doctoral research am I currently supervising, or what exciting stuff is going on at Duke? In the American system, the great thing is we don't necessarily have like individual students from the beginning that we work with. It's much more of a kind of a team approach. So in the New Testament track at Duke, we work together with graduate students. But two of my graduate students, or I should say two of our graduate students, are very well known to many podcast listeners, Ian Mills and Laura Robinson, because they have their own podcast, the NT Review. And anyone that's listening to this that doesn't know about the NT Review, I strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic podcast. And I particularly recommend the April the 1st edition this year, which was off the beaten path for them, because they talked about that apologetics book. What's that apologetics book? Case for Christ? Is that what it's called? So that was a great fun episode. So that's a couple of our wonderful graduate students. They make all our life at those of us that work in the graduate program at Duke, really great place to be. Does anybody would anyone like to make a comment on audio? I'd love to hear other people's voices than just my own.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Wonderful. Hi, my name is Alicia Costello, and I was wondering, so my husband likes to be a super troll, and he likes, the thing he's trolled me on recently is that he thinks Matthew was written first and not Mark.
Hmm.
And he doesn't buy my rebuttal that Mark doesn't make sense if Matthew is written first. So I'd like to know if you have any more comments about, the implausibility of Matthew being first. And actually, I also would like to know how many, like, give me like a percentage that you might think of working scholars who are practicing now who actually think that Matthew is the first gospel.
Hi, Alicia. Brilliant question. Thank you very much for that.
You're
I
welcome.
would
Please help
say,
me
thank
win
you.
this argument.
Okay. I would say that the vast majority of New Testament scholars believe in Marcan Priority. So, question about Marcan Priority and the plausibility of Matthew having been written first. I mean, when I began doing work on the synoptic problem in the 1990s, I would say that the major competitor for the two-source theory, Marcan Priority and Q, was a version of Matthean Priority, the Griesbach hypothesis. And part of that was just the sheer energy of William Farmer and a group of other Griesbach scholars that just really strongly believed Matthew was the first gospel, Luke used Matthew, and Mark used Matthew and Luke. And they were difficult allies because they were incredibly kind and generous to me when I was a young scholar and always gave me a hearing. And of course, I agreed with them on one key element in their whole way of thinking things, which is that Luke knows Matthew. But I so strongly disagree with them about Marcan Priority. So it was always a difficult relationship. I think the thing is, it is so much easier to make sense of Matthew's gospel if you see Matthew as a reading of Mark. I mean, I have an article which is forthcoming, which talks about Matthew as a what I call an orthodox redaction of Mark, playing on Bart Ehrman's idea of orthodox corruption of Scripture, where I think you can repeatedly see how Matthew finds different ways of dealing with oddities in Mark. Where there's a real strange thing in Mark, Matthew just repeatedly kind of sorts it out. And it's very difficult to see things going in the opposite direction. Besides which, I did write this little piece and a couple of NT Pod episodes on it about fatigue, where I argue that it makes a lot of sense to see Matthew as frequently changing the beginning of a pericope in Mark and then gradually drifting into its wording as you go along. So I am still strongly convinced that Mark was the first gospel. I don't know if that will help you, Alicia, to win your argument with your husband, your partner, but there we go. Now you're all. Do you want to do you want to come back on that, Alicia, or is that good?
Oh no, that was great. I definitely think if I explain to him the fatigue thing, and I'll have to go back and listen to your podcast where you explain it further. But I definitely think that will help me at least gain a few more points in his eyes.
Great, thank you. I mean, I have no idea what the podcast is actually like, because like I said, if I actually went back and re-listened to podcasts, I would just stop doing it because I would just be so infuriated with hearing my voice. But I find it difficult enough having to edit individual episodes, but certainly not going back and listening to old ones. Great, thank you. Did I see CJ's hand up there?
Yes, you did.
Hi, CJ. How are you?
Well, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad.
Yeah, so I was curious during your research right now on the present book project, which case for familiarity are you finding more or most difficult to make? Matthew or John's familiarity with Mark, or Matthew, or Luke?
That's a great question. In the early stages of the project, it was definitely Matthew. There are so many clear cases, I think, where Luke is kind of Luke and redaction shows up in John. And you've also have kind of Lucan characters that show up in John, like Mary and Martha, and even names like Lazarus. And so that was always relatively straightforward. And it was so straightforward as well with Luke. You can often see where, I mean, one of the cases for any kind of, and whenever you're making in the case for one author being familiar with another, one of the things you have to do is you have to say, well, are there redactional fingerprints from the one in the other? So can we see Luke's fingerprints anywhere in John? And just to give you one really clear example, in the Last Supper in Luke 22, Satan enters into Judas Iscariot. Now, Satan is the way that Luke generally describes the devil. John doesn't like to use the term Satan. He usually uses the term the devil, something like that. And so when you have Satan entering into Judas Iscariot in Luke, and it shows up in exactly the same position in John, it's just little things like that that make the case. Mark is really easy to make the case for, and in some senses, perhaps it's the strongest case of all, because I think structurally Mark and John are so similar. But Matthew is a little harder because there are no bits of Matthew where you, as a reader of Matthew, think of, like, there's really, really obvious things in Matthew where you think, oh yeah, well that shows up in John. So you have to look a little deeper. But once you have looked deeper, I think there are so many places as well where Matthean fingerprints show up in John. Just to give you one example, the story of the crown of thorns that you get in both Matthew and John, the way that John rephrases the story of the crown of thorns being twisted and put onto Jesus's head is exactly as Matthew rephrases Mark at that place. And it's one of those places you look at commentators on Matthew. Commentators on Matthew have no trouble at all in saying Matthew has here redacted Mark. Characteristically, he's just reworded things in the characteristic way he does. They don't say he's got separate oral tradition. And then there's John with exactly the same phrasing. So there are a bunch of cases of John's use of Matthew. I was also really helped by James Barker's book on John's use of Matthew. So when I was beginning work on John and the Synoptics, round about then, that must have been when James Barker's book came out, and that was helpful as well. But that's the hardest one though, CJ. So it's a useful question, but I'm still convinced that John knows Matthew as well. And there's a bunch of cases like that crown of thorn ones. Sorry, like that crown of thorns one. How does that how does that help, CJ? Any good?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you so much. I've always been curious about whether or not the directionality with John and Luke, whether Luke's familiar with John or John's familiar with Luke. But the discussion of the use of the term Satan and entering into Judas being a common name from Luke and uncommon name for John definitely argues in favor of one direction over the other, at least in that
right case.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and a good friend of mine, Barbara Shellard, we were at graduate school together, and we didn't call it graduate school in Oxford. We just called it, don't know what we called it, just called it university. But Barbara Shellard wrote a book called New Light on Luke, and she argued that Luke was effectively the fourth gospel, that Luke knew John as well as Matthew and Mark. So we used to argue long into the evenings about what the direction of dependence was. So I have thought about it very seriously, also because my friend Mark Matson wrote a Duke dissertation some years ago about the time as Barbara Shellard, and he argued also that Luke knew John. I'll tell you one of the main reasons that I think it doesn't work. It's the story of the anointing. When you get to the anointing in John chapter 12, you can see a Lucan detail coming in. And the Lucan detail that comes in is that Mary wipes Jesus's feet with her hair. Now, that's only in Luke's anointing story and John. So it's Luke chapter 7, John chapter 12. But what's weird about it makes sense in Luke 7 because she has wept tears onto Jesus's feet and then wipes them with her hair. So the tears end up on her hair. That's fine. But in John, what's happened is she has anointed Jesus's feet with oil, and this oil, this nard, is extremely expensive. So when Mary wipes Jesus's feet with her hair in John 12, the ointment ends up in Mary's hair, which is the wrong place for it to be. So you can make sense quite often of John as introducing a detail from Luke that has actually made the story go slightly awry. And I think that's makes much better sense in that direction from Luke to John than the other way. And I could add a bunch more similar examples. There are a lot of them clustered in John 11 and 12, which make much better sense, I think, if John knows Luke.
Thank you.
Now, thanks for the question, CJ. Appreciate it. Do I see a hand up? Michael Strickland, my friend Michael Strickland.
Yes, my hand is up.
Fantastic. Hello, how are you? How are you, Michael?
Doing fine. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller.
Great. Yes, everyone's first time callers this time, including me. The so I should say to everybody else, I was asked a nice question by Andrew Doole about graduate students I'm working with. So CJ, who we've just talked to, is a former grad student at Duke in the master's program, currently finishing his doctorate at Rice. And Michael is a former student from the University of Birmingham PhD program who wrote a fine PhD all about the synoptic problem and how evangelicals in particular dealt with the synoptic problem.
That's correct. And my first question is, do we have to talk about the synoptic problem?
No, I actually haven't worked on the synoptic problem for years. I mean, the only reason I end up talking about it is people always asking me questions about it.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone still considers you one of the authorities, and so you're going to continue to get those questions. Although
we'll also
I appreciate your scholarship branching out from that. Certainly, that's been clear over the past 7 years. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and also to be fair, I always feel whenever I go back to the synoptic problem that it's a little bit like coming home. So if I'm ever going through a difficult patch with writing or with research, quite often I'll just go back because there's always more stuff to be done on the synoptic problem. And in fact, I very, very rarely have sleepless nights. But the other night, when it was really, really stormy, I think it was Sunday night here, we had lots of storms. And my mind was racing on all sorts of other things. And so I did what I do on those occasions and thought about the synoptic problem and realized while I was lying in bed that there's a really, really good counter to one of Streeter's arguments in the four Gospels that I've completely missed in 20 years. And I nearly got up and started writing it up there and then, but I thought, well, I'll think it through first. So I've been thinking about that all week. And in fact, on a walk the other day, I kind of crystallized the argument. And it's one of those things which you sometimes get in research where you think, on the one hand, it's fantastic that I've got a new argument. But then on the other hand, you think, how did I miss this? It's so obvious. How's everybody missed this? I mean, so if we run out of questions and comments, I'll tell you what that is. Or otherwise, I'll have to save it up for a future NT pod or a future article. But anyway, yeah. So it is true that I do still work on the synoptic problem. I can't help myself.
Right. Well, I'll branch out just a little, and I'd love to hear you basically riff on this. It's probably you've never thought about it before, but you've got the Jerusalem letter in Acts 15 that is on the one hand, it's groundbreaking, and on the other, I can't find reference to it in history. So my question to you is, do you have an opinion on the historicity of the letter to begin with? But second of all, it strikes me that maybe this has something to do with Q, and what I mean by that is, here we have a letter posited for which we have no evidence, and yet it's clear that the Acts narrative is based partly on the assumption that it is real. So I just would love to know, kind of let that stew in your mind for a moment, and some thoughts. I don't have any specific goal here.
Sure. I mean, I do love thinking about Acts 15 and Galatians 2. So for any listeners not familiar with Acts 15, it's the Jerusalem Council where James, Peter and company get together with Paul, and they basically have to thrash out, is it okay for Gentiles to eat with Jews? And it ends up with a letter. It's everything is harmonious, and they end up with a nice letter being written, which Paul and Silas then take with them. And there's lots of things of interest there. One of them, if I can say something autobiographically, Ed Sanders, who was one of my teachers in Oxford, used to say that one of the only topics that was as difficult as the synoptic problem was Pauline chronology. And I must admit, the undergraduate student me, because he would say that quite often, the undergraduate me said secretly in my head, challenge accepted. So I've always been desperate to write something about Pauline chronology. And I did actually about 6 or 7 years ago formulate a hypothesis on Acts 15 and on Galatians 2. And in fact, I wrote a massive series of podcasts on them. Not podcasts, what's it called when you write? Blogs. That's the one. The thing I used to do before podcasting. I wrote a massive series of blog posts on Acts 15 and Galatians 2 and other stuff. My firm opinion is that what Luke is narrating in Acts in chapter 15 is his particular take on the same thing that we're hearing about in Galatians 2. Whether there was a historical letter actually written, I don't know. There's one very fishy thing about it, which is that in the whole of Acts of the Apostles, the one thing that Luke never says about Paul is the one thing we know about him for absolutely certain, which is that Paul wrote letters. And it's such a suspicious silence that it makes me wonder if it's deliberate, so that Paul, by the time Luke is writing, is so well known through his letters that he's actually trying to balance this up a little bit by talking about Paul, the man, the missionary, the early Christian, as well as Paul, well, instead of Paul, the letter writer. And there's something even more peculiar, which is the only time Paul is associated with letter writing is in Acts 15, when he takes somebody else's letter away. And what's more, it's a letter written by James. So there's something quite odd going on there. And I do think that it's deliberate on Luke's part. So, one of the things I think is genuinely fascinating about looking at Acts of the Apostles and comparing it with Paul's letters is that a lot of the things you can see the author doing in Acts of the Apostles are the same things you can see the author doing with Matthew and Mark in the Gospel. The most obvious one is the rejection at Nazareth, which comes in Mark chapter 6 and in Matthew chapter 13. In Luke's Gospel is brought all the way forward to Luke chapter 4, 1 to 16. And Luke does that often. He will pull something forward if he thinks it has real significance. And you can see that with the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. It's far too early in the narrative for it to work. It must have been later in Paul's career, as you can see from Galatians 2. That's why when you see any of those reconstructions of Paul's life that are overly dependent on Acts of the Apostles, you end up with a really distorted looking Pauline career. Too much has to be squeezed into Acts 13 and 14. You have to get kind of nearly 20 years into 2 chapters, and it just doesn't work. It produces a distorted chronology. And on this, sorry, one last comment on that. On this, there's a nice kind of bit of Duke consensus, at least consensus between me and Douglas Campbell, in that Douglas Campbell, in his book on Pauline chronology, basically argues the thesis, which I think is unassailable, which is that you have to begin with Paul's letters if you're going to produce a Pauline chronology that really works. That's have I danced around your question, Michael?
You've danced very well around it.
Okay.
No, actually, you did a good job of giving a context and helping me see what you think Luke was doing in including that story. And I know it's tedious to talk about historicity oftentimes, but
I don't know. I love it.
Well,
I'm one of those people that wants to know what really happened.
Absolutely. So it does strike me that if such a letter existed, this would have been known in early Christendom and shared, and would have been, there would be reference to it by church fathers and things like this. And now I don't know it all, so I could be just missing it, but I see no reference to someone saying this church had a copy of this letter, so that does strike me. And, so when we talk about Q, the argument that there was this saying source that was somehow, being shared around among early Christians, and yet we don't have any copies of it. That sounds similar to me, even though I don't know where I'm going with that. So anyway,
sure. No, it's a great observation. I mean, I suppose the couple of other things that I would add to that. One is our friend Alan Garrow argues that letter in Acts 15, if I remember rightly, may survive at least in part in the pages of the Didache, which is a really interesting hypothesis. Another thing that I've often wondered is if you actually look at what's being argued in Acts 15, what Gentiles are told to do is remarkably similar to 1 Corinthians. So one of the things that happens is it actually makes 1 Corinthians look like a kind of consensus early church document that one of Paul's biggest worries in 1 Corinthians is Gentiles eating idol meat. And that's exactly what's in focus in Acts 15. And it is true that I think lots of Christian Jews, especially in the middle of the first century, maybe carrying on right into the late first century and into the second, were just appalled by the idea of Gentiles eating meat that had any kind of connection with idol worship, with the temple. So that I think is a point in common between the two. Now whether that's Luke, doing something sort of creative and producing that, I mean, who knows? Maybe there was a core of some small little kind of letter of some sort that was then expanded in this fictional direction by Luke. I don't know, but it's a really interesting question. I agree. Hugo, do I see your hand up as well? Hugo Mendez.
Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Hi, Hugo. How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. I mean, the idea of doing a live episode of the NT Pod came about because of coronavirus. I thought, well, I spotted my great colleagues, graduate students at Duke, Ian Mills and Laura Robinson, doing something similar. I mean, not live, but doing a kind of a feedback episode. And I was on one of my walks listening to them sort of responding to people's calls, and I thought, hey, I could do that. So that was the origin of this idea. So the idea being that if we are all stuck at home, we may as well, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade, sort of thing. But
right.
But anyway,
right.
Yeah. But so to listeners who don't know Hugo Mendez, he is a professor at my I was going to say our rival school, except the idea that it's a big rival is mainly a fiction created just to sort of spice things up. But UNC Chapel Hill, and Hugo's just recently had published in JSNT, Journal for the Study of the New Testament, a piece about the Johannine community, and you should all have a look at it if you haven't had a look at it already. It's great.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Well, the question is not actually mine. I'm here right now in Georgia. I'm actually chanting in a closed church on live stream because this is the wild realities of coronavirus. But I have here an undergraduate, graduating senior here from the University of Georgia, Jacob Sparks, who had a question, I think following up on Alicia's question earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what I was wondering is, because I have, being Eastern Orthodox, I have sort of dual interests in New Testament and patristics. And I was wondering what you would think of those who would make the argument for Matthean priority, trying to go off of the patristic evidence for that.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I've always battled a bit with the patristic evidence, and somebody gave me a really hard time for disposing with the patristic evidence in only a few pages in my little book on the synoptic problem called A Way Through the Maze. I think the problem is that so much of the patristic evidence is people who are making inferences on the basis of the biblical text. So often you can actually see the kind of thing that they're doing. You can see why they've made the inferences that they've made. And as early as our evidence goes is Papias. And the difficulties with Papias, it doesn't look like he affirms Matthean priority. It's very difficult to tell because we only have what he says about Matthew and Mark as it's quoted by Eusebius in the 4th century. But when you look at Papias, it's just possible that Papias actually thought of Mark as being the first gospel. And I think the inference that Matthew was first isn't made on the same basis that we make it by studying the parallels. That they weren't actually opening the synopsis and saying, "Oh, I wonder if Matthew's used Mark here." And if you think that Matthew is one of the apostles, as most of these church writers, these patristic writers, thought. It was an obvious thing to think, well, maybe the gospel bearing that apostle's name comes before Mark, when Mark was a disciple of Peter. So you have like a kind of a primary gospel like Matthew and a secondary gospel like Mark. I mean, so I don't think that they were making their judgments on the same basis that we are. And I don't think that they had any inside information. That's the big question. I mean, did they have special inside information? And I just don't think that's the case. So the patristic evidence needs to be taken seriously, needs to be explained, but I think we have to treat it with caution. There's a great bit actually in Hugo's recent Bible and Interpretation response to Paul Anderson, who'd responded to his article where he says, where I have to choose between, I'm paraphrasing dramatically now, it's something like where we have to choose between confidence and caution, that he chooses caution. So I think the patristic evidence on the ordering of the Gospels is one where I would choose caution.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that's good to hear, because I'm quite comfortable dispensing with some of the opinions of the fathers, but I'm quite fond of others. So that's something I could definitely accept.
Right, exactly. Thank you very much for that. Are we good for me to look at one or two of the questions that have come up in chat? It's a little harder for me to do this on the hoof, but I'll take a look. Kelly Victor says, I've been listening through the podcast from the beginning, and I think it was episode 10 that had an Eddie Izzard bit at the end. I was wondering why there was so much empty space after the episode was over, and I was thrilled when I heard Eddie's voice. Yeah, I absolutely adore Eddie Izzard. For people who don't know, he's a British comedian, stand-up comedian, but he's also done quite a bit of acting. And he's a very, very intelligent man, and he loves talking about the ancient world, and he loves talking about religion. And so if I remember rightly, the clip that I used was him talking about 1 Corinthians. It's a little difficult because if you listen to the entire clip of Eddie Izzard, there's quite a bit of swearing in it, and I want to keep my podcast getting a kind of family-friendly rating, so I had to sort of select a little bit. But I think it's a hysterical piece where he tries to imagine the Corinthians writing a letter back to Paul. And what's joyful about it is it's exactly what New Testament scholars do. They try and reconstruct what the community would have been saying to Paul that makes Paul want to write to them. So Eddie Izzard just kind of latches onto that in the most hilarious way. I only really came up with the idea of adding little sound clips to the NT pod after just one day thinking that that's something I do in class quite a bit. It often livens things up, and also it's the kind of thing which you can only do once you've got sophisticated enough at being able to grab audio. But once you've actually done that, it becomes a lot of fun to do. The only problem is, and the reason I don't do it more often, is that it takes ages. So in the recent episodes on the Gospel of Jesus's Wife, I grabbed quite a few bits of audio, and the thing is, it's partly you have to sort of watch through and listen to a huge amount to select the little terse bit that you actually want, and then when you're grabbing it, trying to edit it and splice it in a way that doesn't make it kind of tedious and all the rest of it is difficult. In fact, I prepared an entire episode of the NT pod, which I didn't record, about 2 weeks ago. I was teaching Secret Gospel of Mark in my non-canonical Gospels class, and I prepared a whole episode in the NT pod, and I spent ages editing little bits of Morton Smith from Jesus the Evidence and getting them all ready. I ran out of time actually to record the episode, so it will happen at some point. But my idea there is that the fun thing was I could actually have Morton Smith telling his own story rather than me telling it in my own more kind of jaundiced way. So I'm pleased to hear you, Kelly, referring to one of those audio clips, because I always really enjoy doing them. Guest 18, it struck me in the latest podcast episode how different Paul's overview of the resurrection aftermath is from Mark's, in particular the lack of women. Could I give more thoughts on that? It's so striking, the difference between Paul and Mark. So 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells of a series of appearances. He only names male characters. And then in Mark's gospel, he doesn't tell about any resurrection appearances in chapter 16 and only names female characters. The only person common to the two is Peter. So in Mark 16:7, you have go and tell the disciples and Peter. And in 1 Corinthians 15:4, we have the Lord appearing to Peter. Does he say the Lord? Christ died for us in according to the scriptures, buried. Yes, I think so. He says, and he appeared. Yes, he doesn't say the Lord, he says he appeared to Peter. So Peter's the only one that's common to the two. It's so striking that it's entirely possible that it's deliberate. A former grad student of mine and friend of mine, Ken Olson, argued that, and I don't think he's published this, so I hope he won't mind me mentioning it, but he speculated that Mark 16 in a way provides a kind of prequel to what you've got in 1 Corinthians 15. It gives you all the stuff that you haven't got in 1 Corinthians 15. So you have that very terse line in 1 Corinthians 15 that he was buried. And so you then have a lot of time spent on the burial in Mark. And then in between burial and appearing to Peter, you have this whole other story. So he wonders if it's something written to supplement the Pauline charisma. But fascinating, the differences between the two. And that's why in that lecture from 2016, which was in the last episode of the NT pod, that's why I focused mainly on 1 Corinthians and Mark as the two earliest sources of the resurrection. Just going through the chat. Fiona Thompson. Hi, Fiona. When you teach the synoptic problem, how many of your students stick with the Q hypothesis rather than being swayed away from Q? Great question. The answer is that I have to try. I would love to hear what I've asked Q scholars occasionally about this, and they generally react in rather a baffled way. But one of the things I find really difficult about teaching Q is that I find that my undergraduates are instantly skeptical about it. And so what I have to do is work really hard to persuade them of the plausibility of Q before I tell them what my own particular view is. Because I think I mean, this is one of the reasons that when I wrote a case against Q, I knew it was the right thing to begin with the rhetoric that is used in the case for Q, because I knew that it was a problem to a lot of people. And by that, what I mean is there are many people who are put off the Q hypothesis, not because they've studied the synoptic problem and think that an alternative is more plausible, but they don't like the increasing tangibility of Q. They don't like people talking about Q chapter 4, verse 16, Q chapter 4, verses 1 to 13, Q 6, 20 to 49, this sort of thing, because it makes it sound more concrete than it is. And in my experience, especially with undergraduate students, when they see that language, they feel, and I'm sorry if this sounds unduly harsh to my friends who are Q scholars, but a lot of my undergraduates, they feel when they hear that they've been duped. They feel, well, I've been told that there's this text with chapter and verse, which actually there's no manuscript evidence for. So one of the things that I have to do is try and work hard to rebuff a lot of that innate skepticism that people have. And that's why I'm always interested to know what my Q-believing friends find in the classroom, because I get a lot of hostility about Q that I actually have to try and counteract. I'm always saying, look, this is actually a really good theory. It's just that it's not as good a theory as the alternative, in my opinion, that Luke knew Matthew. And you know, I often find myself having to say that I actually really like Q. I think that there's loads in the Q theory that makes lots of sense. It's just that the competing hypothesis that Luke knew Matthew is, I think, better because it has fewer problems than the Q hypothesis and actually explains what Luke is doing much more happily than the Q theory does. So I must admit, I almost never have students who believe in Q, and that's a sort of a difficult one, I suppose, because you know, I mean, I suppose on some level my terrible bias is affecting people. I'll go back to the chat in a little bit, but I want to give an opportunity for those who are on audio to pitch in. Jose, do you have a question?
Yes. So my question is, I know you've worked on some series about Jesus, and I was curious if there are any certain portrayals or interpretations that you see more often than others, and if there are any that specifically like stand out to you.
Sure, it's a great question. I've the most recent series I worked on was called Jesus His Life, which was broadcast last year on History Channel, and it was one of those that did go out in different countries, so more people have seen it. It was a lovely series. It was a docudrama, so lots of documentary, but also quite a lot of acting. And each week they took a particular character from the Jesus story, beginning with Joseph at the very beginning, and I think ending with Peter. Did we go Peter at the end? I think we did. I think Mary Magdalene, the penultimate episode. I really enjoy working on those kind of shows when I have the privilege of being asked to work on them, because it actually helps you to think really seriously about how you communicate your scholarship to a wider public. And that's a challenge which I think all scholars do need to think seriously about. So I enjoy really trying to think, how do you actually take what are sometimes quite complex ideas and find a simpler way of saying them? I enjoy the shows most when I am behind the camera as well as in front of it. Specifically, if I've got a kind of consultant's role. And I don't want to sound too sort of highfalutin, because the role that a scholar has is always a very minor one. It's always it's never, at least in my case, it's never like a kind of producing role. But you do have a decent amount of say as a consultant. And one of the things that they are usually really, really keen on is to make sure that the material is as accurate as possible historically. And so they're basically, to some extent, you're a fact checker, but also there are certain things, and this gets to your question, Jose, about repeated features. One of the things that I think one is very, very conscious of whenever you watch any Jesus film, any Jesus documentary, is how are the Jewish characters in the story depicted? How is Jesus depicted? How are the disciples depicted? How are people who have often been depicted very negatively, like the Pharisees and the chief priests, how are they being depicted? Because quite often, we as New Testament scholars, we spend lots and lots of time obsessing about this, and quite rightly worrying about how we represent the story that you find in the Gospels. But for documentary makers and drama makers coming at it fresh, they inherit a kind of a view of the story which has often got quite profound anti-Jewish elements in it. So one of the things that I think one can do to steer these things is often say, could one actually try saying it this way? Could one try saying things that way, and make people very aware of those sorts of things? So to give a specific example, the thing I enjoyed working on more than anything else was a BBC HBO drama which came out in 2008, and it's just called The Passion. It's largely forgotten now because Mel Gibson's The Passion, which was earlier than that, but Mel Gibson's Passion is the thing which sticks in people's heads, quite rightly, because it was so enormous and it was such a commercial success that some tiddly little TV drama is not generally remembered. But the whole piece was a 4-episode miniseries, and it was written by an Irish guy, wonderful Irish guy called Frank Deasy, who's now no longer with us. And I used to have long conversations with him as he was writing these scripts. He would just call, and we would just talk for ages as he tried to work out how to do things. And from very early on, before Frank was on board, one of the things that the producer, Nigel Stafford-Clark, said is he really, really liked the idea of making sure that everybody in the drama were not cartoon characters. They were not kind of caricatures. So you don't have like a kind of an evil Caiaphas and a tormented Judas, but we actually explore their characters in a much more empathetic way. And to be involved in the creative process, at least by being a sounding board and making suggestions and hearing what really brilliant creative people are doing, it was just one of the most enjoyable experiences of my life. And I don't think I mind saying that when I watched the very rough edit of the first episode, they sent it over to me a good, I don't know, maybe 3 months or so before it was on TV. I wept. I couldn't believe how good it was. And I still think it's one of the best Jesus films, Jesus dramas I've seen. So that's one which I would always go back to. Does that, I muted you because there was some echo coming through, but does that answer your question a bit, Jose?
Yes.
Well, thank you. Great question. Anybody else on audio want to ask a question, or shall I return to the chat? Krista, I'm not sure if it's Fauria says, what areas of New Testament scholarship do you expect will yield the most interesting work in the next 10 years? That's a great question, but it's a really difficult one to answer because I must admit I tend to be, in some of my interests, a bit old-fashioned. So I really enjoy myself what are often thought of as the New Testament introduction questions. So if you go to a New Testament introduction, you get dates of the Gospels, authors of the Gospels, synoptic problem, did John know the synoptics, this sort of thing. And I must admit, I just find those things fundamentally fascinating. And to that extent, I'm a little bit off the beaten track because I think a lot of other people tend to like to look for the newest trends in scholarship and to find ways in which interdisciplinary studies can really help you. So it's not that I think those things aren't all fantastic, but it's just that there don't tend to be things that I myself have got ever so involved in. I suppose if I were to put my finger on one thing that has, and if you don't mind me answering just for myself, I just find it much more interesting answering about my own interests, because otherwise I've got to kind of project onto other people. But the thing that I find, I suppose that will continue to be interesting is the discussion of gender and the discussion of women in early Christianity. I think that just continues to yield absolutely fascinating insights, especially as you start moving beyond the canon, because I think a lot of the time people are just so focused on women in the Gospels, women in Paul's letters, that they forget that there's all sorts of work to be done on 2nd and 3rd century texts. And I personally find that stuff endlessly fascinating. I've got a couple of pieces that are a little bit in the hopper at the moment, which take feminist approaches to different texts. And it's something I've written about a little bit before. I recently published an essay about Mary Magdalene, which I called The Magdalene Effect. And it's all about how our obsession with the character of Mary Magdalene is actually causing us, rather bizarrely, even though it's very well intentioned, it's actually causing us to marginalize many of the other women in the gospel story. So when you look to popular fiction, when you look to film, when you look to scholarly treatments, people are so obsessed with Mary Magdalene that they're forgetting all these other fascinating characters like Joanna, who you get in Luke 8, 1-3, Susanna. Who are these people? I mean, they are written about so little compared to Mary Magdalene. And it's not that Mary Magdalene isn't fascinating. She is. And I've got good grief. I think there's several NT pod episodes that touch on her in different ways. It's that sometimes by focusing on her and loading all of our attention on her, we actually miss many other characters of interest. And I have to publish my piece on Junior at some point. I did an NT pod episode on it really right in the early days, and I have a paper on it, but I've just never got round to finishing writing it. For myself, therefore, I think one of the issues, one of the areas that I really look forward to seeing continue to develop is our feminist approaches to the New Testament. That's never going to go away. That's never going to go away, and it's really, I think, been a fantastic addition, extra dimension to work that's gone on. It's been great stuff. Carl Taps says, I very much like your elegant explanation for the walking cross in the Gospel of Peter. Oh yes, I did enjoy. I like that myself. Your explanation seems to make perfect sense. However, I've not heard it shared by others. Do others share your explanation? And if not, what do you think? Why do you think there's resistance? So, the actual argument that I make is that the original text of the Gospel of Peter is a speculative argument, and I'm one of these people that think that speculation shouldn't be a dirty word. Our choice is often either informed speculation or ignorance, and so I choose informed speculation. But the theory on the walking, talking cross, I mean, for those that don't remember it, the basic problem is that in the Gospel of Peter, when Jesus walks out of the tomb with two angels, the cross walks out of the tomb as well. And then when a voice is heard from heaven addressing the cross answers. The voice from heaven says, have you been preaching to those that are asleep? And the cross says yes. And it's just, it's the strangest piece. I mean, why is the cross in the tomb with Jesus? And what what does one make of an animated cross in the story? And I just toyed with the idea once that maybe the original text of the Gospel of Peter didn't say cross, stauros in Greek, but said crucified one, staurothenta. And that would become plausible if the word that was being used for staurothenta, the crucified one, was a nomen sacrum, a sacred abbreviation. So you've just taken like the first three letters of staurothenta, which are also the first three letters of stauros cross. So my speculation is there was originally a nomen sacrum saying the crucified one, and that this was misread by one of the scribes, either our scribe of the one text that we have of this, the Achaemenid Codex, or by somebody that was writing before him. Somebody misread crucified one as cross, and that's how the confusion entered in. It's pure speculation on my part, a conjectural emendation of the text. The reason why it's not received widespread acceptance is that I've not written it up. This is the story of my life. I have, about 10 articles that I've basically written, but I've never got around to publishing. Sometimes it takes me a while. That piece that I just mentioned about Mary Magdalene, I wrote that 10 years ago, and it took me quite a long time, lots of revision to get it sorted. I don't really I'm not that trigger happy. Maybe I should be more trigger happy. So I tend to like to sit on things for a while. So with the Gospel of Peter thing, I simply have to write it up. What I did was something which in some ways I regret. I wrote a blog post on it, and when I'm writing a blog post, I write in a much more colloquial kind of way, and it was undeveloped and so on. And then Paul Foster from the University of Edinburgh wrote a peer-reviewed article response to my blog post, which I was a bit disappointed by, because I think if you're responding to a blog, respond in a blog. If you're responding to a podcast, respond, in a podcast. But if you're writing a peer-reviewed article, you really need to be dealing with other peer-reviewed articles. So that's actually kind of slowed me down in my revision of it, because I have the complicated thing of now having to engage with a critique of something I haven't really written yet, or at least that I haven't revised. But I'm grateful to you for the encouragement, because I've always been quite fond of my theory and I would love it if it was right. And I still think there's a reasonable chance that it might be. So thank you for mentioning that. We've actually run up to our time limit of 3 o'clock. It seems to have gone quite quickly to me. Maybe if we do one of these again, I should allow a little bit extra time, but I'm conscious of the fact that I did say we would do an hour and keep it at that. And I also I'll put a recording of this out on the regular feed as well. So I want to make sure that it's not too long. But huge thanks to everyone for coming along. My biggest concern in setting this up is that it might just be me sitting here on my own with my cats, and that it would just be a case of me rambling on. But then I decided that if that was the case, I just got various bits and pieces that I could chat about, and then after that I could release that on the ordinary feed. So it's been really nice to engage with real people, and it's been great to engage with some old friends and to meet some new ones as well. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I shall see you again soon. If you enjoyed this episode as a live episode of the NT Pod and would like me to do it again, I'm happy to do it again in a few weeks. If you'd rather I just stuck to doing the normal kinds of them, then I'll stick to that as well. But thanks everyone for listening, thanks for joining in, and I'll speak to you again soon. Well, thanks for listening to this latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always good to have your company, and it was particularly good to have the company of people in real time today. As I said at the beginning, if you'd like another one of these episodes, let me know, and we'll try it again in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, you can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, Apple Podcasts, Duke's Apple Podcasts, and Facebook and Twitter. Look for Goodacre over on Twitter. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.